My name is Dr. Michael Wilcox. I'm the Associate Director of the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development, fondly known as the NCRCRD. And I wanted to thank everyone today for joining us. We have a great group of folks that have joined us today for the webinar, Remaining Land Grant Fierce While Accepting the Land Grab Truth of Our Foundation. And our primary speaker today is going to be Dr. Stephen Gavazzi from Ohio State University. He's also a faculty fellow at the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development. So we're excited to host our faculty fellow today to hear about the work that he has been doing at Ohio State. If we could move to the next slide. I did want to remind everyone we have a webinar coming up next month, Moving Rural Communities Forward, Future Opportunities for Rural Workforce and Rural Development Through Extension. And this is going to be presented by Sheila Martin, formerly from APLU, and Tanya Hall from Purdue Extension. I may sneak in there as well, as this is a project that we're working on funded by Ascendium, looking at workforce development primarily in rural areas. It's an exciting new project that we've been working on. We're piloting it in 3 different communities across the United States, Utah, Arkansas, and Indiana, and it will be a fun and information-packed webinar next month. So please do register for that and come back and see us next month. So we're just going to go ahead and get started. I have a few slides. I have 5 slides that I'd like to kick things off with, if I may, and then I'm going to hand things off to Steve and be able to, he has a very long bio that I will read through to all of you as we get started and kick things off with Steve. But before we do that, I wanted to provide a little bit of context. Many of you know, probably everyone on this webinar knows, that 2 years ago, there was a report issued through High Country News called LandGrab Universities. And that actually came out just over a year ago on April 1st in 2020. And it was a very interesting study, very highly detailed. And Steve's going to go into some of the findings of that study today. It's really the impetus for everything that we're going to be talking about today. If we go to the next slide, you'll see a year after that study came out. So this would be a year ago. Almost now, it was March 3rd, I believe, we actually hosted, the NCRCRD hosted our very first webinar through Purdue University. So we were hosted by Michigan State University for a decade, and then prior to that, Iowa State University. We have been hosted by Purdue University almost going on 2 years. It's about 18 months. And it was our first webinar last year, Equitable Access to Cooperative Extension Services for Indigenous Communities. And we had just the honor of having Dr. Katie Hartman and Aaron Riley join us. At the time, Katie was at Colorado State. She's now at Iowa State. She was presenting her dissertation research, really looking at the relationships between the 1862 land grants and the 1994 land grants out west. And Aaron, of course, leading the way for us at USDA. We had a presentation, and then we had a facilitated discussion. And in that facilitated discussion, we were asking 3 questions. We were asking best practices and what is currently working, what barriers and constraints do we face, and then the dream phase, what can we do in the future? And really trying to lean on that sort of appreciative inquiry construct to really take a look at how we together as the land grant system can address some of the issues and take advantage of some of the opportunities before us. And so that was a year ago. And during that time, we did a jam board. Okay, so this was March of 2021. We were a year into COVID, we're Jamboarding, and we actually had a very, very good session. And we had promised that we were going to, quote unquote, release the results of the Jamboard. And I'm here to show you some of the results of the Jamboard today, finally, a year later. But what a wonderful opportunity to couple this with Steve's work that he'll present here in a moment. So we wound up taking everything, all of the input from everyone that was at the webinar that day, and really breaking it down into 3 categories. And I'm not going to read all these off to everyone, but the first category really wound up being forging relationships, something that we need to do most certainly between the 1862s and the 1994s, as well as all the partners and collaborators that we all work with. There was some very interesting information in here. People were noting that in order to forge relationships, it was going to require patience and an open and honest dialogue. It was going to require commitment. It was going to require us to show up consistently. It was going to require a willingness to hear what needs to change. We need to have the 1862s learn from the 1994s and honor traditional ways of knowing. We need to build personal relationships and then maintain those relationships. And I'm sure that many of you will agree with this, that it does begin with the relationships and trying to figure out who to talk to and where might you meet these folks and begin to forge that relationship is very, very important. But if we go to the next slide, you'll see that while we're forging these relationships, we face constraints. And sometimes when we're going through these facilitative workshops, we wind up spinning our wheels a bit more on the constraints because it's really easy to come up with the things that we're lacking versus the things that we have. Although I think we all recognize that we have a lot of different assets that we bring to the table. Some of the constraints that were brought up, and you see them front and center, I was very intentional in putting them there. Systemic racism is a challenge. Lack of trust is a challenge. Not enough staff is a challenge. But there were a couple that I wanted to lift up and bring up. The two you'll see in white surrounded by black. The first one in the upper right-hand corner, and we wrote these things down verbatim. And so this was educate 1994 staff and colleagues on what the land-grant system is and how the 1994s fit in. And so again, this was over a year ago. And so looking at this again after a year, the context begins to fade away. And certainly in the time that I've spent with at some of the 1994s that I have visited, they certainly have a heavy teaching load. Extension isn't always necessarily front and center. Research may or may not be front and center. So trying to marry all three of the avenues of the land-grant system can sometimes be challenging, but there are many examples, wonderful examples of that being done quite effectively at the 1994s. But when I read this, I thought of something that Stephen actually brought up in two of the papers that he shared with everyone prior to this. And these are actually the words of our friend John Phillips, who many of you know on this webinar. And in a paper that John wrote back, I think it was in 2003, he was talking about what the 1862s can learn from the 1994s rather than the 1994s needing to learn from the 1862s. And I was really struck by this. John wrote, there's a deep embeddedness in the communities that they serve. This is the 1994s through a guiding framework that focuses on the sacredness of land, food, and cultural identity, among other holistic values associated with Indigenous knowledge. And I think if we all ruminate on that a bit and really think about how powerful that statement is that John wrote and what the 1994s are bringing to the table and what Indigenous communities all over the world bring to the table, I think that we can, from an 1862 perspective, can learn a lot from that. And so keep that in mind. The other was in the lower left-hand corner. Explaining land acknowledgements to an audience that may not fully understand what they are, why they are essential, and that lack of understanding may impact support for us to work together. And as Steve points out in his article, there's actually been quite a bit of debate about land acknowledgements. I certainly understand their place. There's a piece or there's a part of the article where he talks about there needs to be a call to action. It's one thing to acknowledge, it's another to call to action. And so the two questions that he challenges us with are, we are on the lands of Indigenous people. What commitments and obligations flow from that acknowledgement? And so I think that that's really, really key for us to keep in mind as we go through what Stephen has to discuss today. So these are the constraints. There's lots of them on there, and hopefully you've taken some time to take a look look at all of them, and the slides will be available to you, so you'll be able to look at this data afterwards. The last slide that I have to present, so we've talked about sort of the forming relationships or forging relationships, recognizing that there are constraints, but we need to facilitate action, kind of what we were getting at when we were talking about the land acknowledgement. And there's a lot of wonderful ideas here. Some of them we could do in the short term if we just put our mind to it. And some of them are more long-term type things that we need to be striving for. So, we need to be focused on reducing barriers for collaborative projects. Among the 1994s, creation of a true state-level unified land-grant system is something that may take some time, sharing resources, offices, funds for staff, and so on. The one at the top, and that's how big the font was when I grabbed it from the presentation, see each other. And I appreciate the size of the font that they use there, because I think that that's something that we need to do is make sure that we do see one another and recognize one another. So forging relationships is really important. Facing those constraints and addressing the constraints is really important as well, but we need to be action focused and really facilitating that action amongst ourselves. And so I'm so pleased to introduce Stephen Gavazzi, who's going to speak with us today. I promised you a wrenchingly long bio, which I'll have to turn away to give. I apologize, because it's on another screen here in my office, but it says Stephen Gavazzi, bio. He's a land-grant fierce professor at The Ohio State University. And his bio goes on to say, dragging land-grant universities kicking and screaming to the truth about their founding since 2020. So with that wonderful bio, I'll hand things off to Stephen. Go for it, Steve.
All right. Well, thank you, Michael. Thanks for that interesting introduction, and also, but more importantly, for the opportunity to speak to our friends, hopefully not only throughout the North Central region, but at least in the continental United States, if not elsewhere, as we continue to grow out interest in this project. I'm going to give a little bit of a heads up about where we're going today. Michael's already introduced the term land-grant fierce. I'll talk a little bit more about what that means, as well as the land grab truth of our foundation in terms of land-grant universities. And it's my belief that the only way we're going to make any progress in this area is to unite these seemingly opposite viewpoints, so that we have a both and not an either or orientation to this kind of work. I want to then spend some time talking about the work that I've done, listening to, acknowledging, and beginning to cataloging the voices of leaders, both from tribal colleges, as well as the leaders of those Native nations whose land was taken and sold in order to found The Ohio State University, as well as 51 other land-grant universities. And then, as it says here, I will be shamelessly promoting a Falcon pre-conference that we are organizing thanks to some NIFA funding that will be focused on 1994 and 1862 partnerships. And the date of October 19th is now firm. That will be the day before the actual Falcon pre-conference, before the Falcon Conference, which will be taking place in Albuquerque, New Mexico. More on that in just a little bit. I also do, though, want to save some time. My hope here is that I'm not just lecturing at you, but that we are also going to sustain a conversation that we will be hearing from you. So please keep in mind that we're going to be having plenty of time set aside for a question and answer, or even not questions, just simply discussing various different issues that come up today. So thank you for your participation, and I'll launch into just a few remarks and then we'll get going on that conversation. So for me, this all started actually back in 2015. I was still the dean and director of one of Ohio State's regional campuses. It was the Mansfield, Ohio campus. And I was, at that time, finishing up a book on campus community relationships, and had happened to run into now West Virginia University president, but at that time, stepping down president from Ohio State University, Gordon Gee. And Gordon and I knew each other from back in 1991 when I first came to Ohio State. This is my 31st year here at Ohio State. And that was Gordon's second year. And it was the first of 2 stints that he did as a university president at Ohio State. And he asked me what I was up to, and I told him about the book. And he said, well, why didn't you talk to me? And I just kind of was taken aback and said, I'm not sure I understand. He said, well, that book that you wrote, you were asking college presidents and town managers what they thought of campus community relationships. And I said, yes. And he said, well, you didn't talk to me. And I thought he was kidding until 2 weeks later, his executive assistant contacted me and said, President Gee wants to set up a time to talk with you. And anyway, long story short, I sat down in an interview with him, and an hour and a half later, I had an entire new chapter on campus community relationships, thanks to the insights that he had about those, what I call town gown relationships. So anyway, published the book a while later, sent President Gee a signed copy. And by that time, he was now the president of West Virginia University. And he sent me back a very nice handwritten note that thanked me for the copy of the book. He told me he especially liked chapter 9. That was the chapter that I added as a result of talking to Gordon. And then he said, it's time for us to write a book together. And again, I made the mistake of thinking that he was kidding. And about a month later, I got a call from his executive assistant, Bonnie Anderson, who said, why are you ignoring President Gee? And I then said I didn't know what she was talking about until I had my eyes scanned my wall and saw the personal handwritten note from Gordon. I said, you mean he's serious about writing a book with me? And anyway, long story short, Bonnie got me on the phone with Gordon. We talked, and he said that he thought the time was right for a book to be written about land-grant universities that focused on the relationship between campuses and communities, since that was, as Gordon says, in the DNA of the land-grant university mission. I ended up interviewing 27 land-grant presidents and chancellors from 1862 land grants, and the book was largely based on those interviews. So that was published in 2018. As a result of that, I was then asked to co-edit a second book called, as it turns out, Fulfilling the 21st Century Land Grant Mission. This was a book that was supposed to be used in celebration of the sesquicentennial celebration of Ohio State. And that was in the year 2020. That was an easy book to put together. There were many people, both at Ohio State and former leaders of Ohio State, who were interested in contributing to that book. And as a result, I handed in that book, the manuscript for that book, in March of 2020. And the following week, I had the opportunity to then witness, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself a little bit, the LandGrab University report, which came out in March of 2020. Again, it was a week after I had handed in the manuscript. And quite frankly, I was floored to have realized that in 30 years at that time of being at Ohio State, having received 3 degrees from 2 land-grant universities myself, that I had never bothered to think about, much less write about, where the land in land-grant came from. So all along, and I'm going to go backwards here a second, the idea of being land-grant fierce was something that I think that both of those books, the one that I co-authored and the one that I co-edited, really were based on this idea of being very proud of the land-grant mission. You can see here, this is from a recent videography that one of the students at the Ohio State University's college student newspaper called Lantern had done on what is a land-grant university. This is episode 2, if folks are interested in Googling that. It's a very good film. But he came up, his name was Christian Harza. Christian came up with this definition of being land-grant fierce. And you can see here, it's this idea of being very, very proud of what it is that land grants are doing in terms of their teaching, research, and community engagement missions. So thinking about that, and then thinking about this idea of being land-grant fierce in the face of the High Country News report really was something that I began to do a lot of thinking about. And so the first point that I want to make about the High Country News report itself is that for those of you who have not seen it, it catalogs exactly which lands from which tribes each land-grant university received in the way of either scrip, if they largely were land-grant universities on or east of the Mississippi, or outright land, and not necessarily land that they built their campuses on, but rather were used to be sold, or in the case of 16 land-grant universities across the country still own land, which generates surface and mineral rights, which contributes to the coffers of the land-grant university. This that you're seeing on your screens right now is a map of the approximately 640,000 acres that were converted into approximately $315,000 of money back in 1870 to found the Ohio State University. There was no land in Ohio that was given to Ohio State through the Morrill Act, but there's a whole separate story that we've now uncovered through our work where there were approximately 73,000 additional acres that were given to Ohio in lands formerly known as Virginia Military District lands, which largely were lands of the Shawnee and the Wyandot, as well as the Potawatomi, who all were involved in a contribution of a different kind of land that was used at the same time that Ohio State was receiving Morrill grant funds. Okay, so this map is representative of what the maps look like for most of the eastern seaboard and east of the Mississippi states. Differently, you can see, and this is just using the University of Wisconsin map, Wisconsin and many other states that are on or west of the Mississippi actually receive the vast majority of their lands from tribes within their state boundaries. And so there's a big difference that we may end up talking about a little bit later in our discussion about the easternmost land grants and what happened to those more western located land grant universities in terms of the land and obligations. In any event, once I really sank my teeth into this report in terms of what was going on with regards to the sale of the land and how that really related to the foundation of the universities, I began to talk about this in terms of the original sin of the land grant universities. But you will notice, and this is a journal, special issue of the Native American and Indigenous Studies journal, NASA, that had asked me to make a contribution. I was writing, even here, the very first scholarly product of my work was trying to think about how to remain proud of the land grant mission and to stand behind the tripartite mission of the land grant university, and at the same time, as it says here, insisting on some form of contrition and repentance with regards to where we got the foundational dollars that started all of this. What happened fortuitously for me and many of my partners at The Ohio State University was that we had a new president coming on board, Christina Johnson, and in Christina Johnson's first year of her presidency, recognizing the immense call for social justice that was going on at a national level, decided to put $1 million of Ohio State's money toward racial justice-oriented issues. And so a call was made for researchers. And again, this was very heavily a research-focused call for people who would be able to do something about racial justice from a scholarship perspective. We were one of 83 projects that had been submitted. Out of those 83, we were the only project that had a Native American focus. And so I think for that reason and that reason alone, we were one of the first 10 funded projects by The Ohio State University. And we came to call this project the Stepping Out and Stepping Up project. And as it says on the screen, we were really asking people to step out of their comfort zones and begin to step up to the responsibilities associated with this land grab nature of the Ohio State's founding. In actuality, the Stepping Out and Stepping Up project has become 4 separate but related initiatives. And again, when people ask me, is there administrative support for what you're doing? I always tell people follow the money. And so to date, we have received $230,000, so just around $250,000 of internal funds from Ohio State in order to do the kind of work that we felt needed to be done. We do think that at this point, we've probably tapped out our internal funds for the time being. And so as you will hear, what we've really set out to do is to begin to look for external monies that would continue to support this kind of activity. I wanted to just take a brief moment to give a shout out to the project leaders who are involved here. You will notice that it is a mix of Native and non-Native scholars. I have come to believe over the last now almost 2 years of forming this group and working with these individuals and their colleagues that there is a lot to be learned from establishing a research team, or any team for that matter, that has a mix of Native and non-Native representatives. I think that it is a two-way street. I think that I have certainly learned quite a bit from my Native colleagues, and in turn, it's fair to say, because I've sat in interviews with them, that they also have learned quite a bit about especially the workings of universities from me and from the other non-Native scholars who are a part of this project. We've also, just by the way, attempted to catalog everything that we've done along the way. So there is a blog site, you can see the address up there. It's basically LandGrant Truth. And what we've been trying to do is every time there is an article, an interview, or anything else that's related to the work that we've been doing through the Stepping Out and Stepping Up project, that we have been placing that here on this particular website. So a lot of the things that I have talked about and will be talking about exist somewhere on this website. I want to speak just for a moment more about the first lead project that we got. This was actually a partnership with First Nations Development Institute. We were very fortunate to have First Nations as our community partner. You'll see that I'm name checking 2 people. First, Mike Roberts, who's the president and CEO of FNDI. And then just as, if not more importantly, Rick Williams, who is his title within FNDI is Indigenous Consultant. Rick was the main contact that we had for the work that we did in this first project. And as you see on the screen here, it talks about our ability to focus attention on those tribes whose land was taken and sold in order to found or establish Ohio State as an institution of higher learning. What Rick did, and by the way, Rick is the former head of the American Indian College Fund and also serves in a consultant capacity for many other indigenous-oriented organizations across the country, was that we had a research protocol that allowed us to talk to, as it turns out, 12 of the tribes, the leaders of those tribes whose land was taken and sold to found Ohio State. That was remarkable that we were able to pull that off in the middle of the pandemic, especially because these tribal leaders were obviously faced with many, many, many more important things than talking to a researcher about these kinds of issues, given the disproportionate impact that COVID had on Native Americans across the country. So we're very proud of the fact that we were able to work with Rick to make those 12 interviews happen. We also, though, realized that we didn't just have to approach the leaders of those Native nations, but also could be in contact with leaders of tribal colleges, because those tribal colleges have a covenant with the Native nations that they are designed to serve, in ways in which we could also tap into their own perspectives on the needs of tribes through conversations with the tribal college leaders as well. So as it turns out, we also had a total of 12 leaders of tribal colleges who we also had spoken to during the project. The first set of interviews that we did with those leaders of tribal colleges, we've already written about, and that is actually available through the Tribal College Journal. It is an online format, and so it's very easy to find this. The article, in a nutshell, talked about how there was, in fact, a great need for partnerships to be developed with what, for want of a better way of describing it, was really the much more well-resourced 1862 land grants. So it is fair to say that the imbalance is so great in terms of the resources that have been given to 1862s over the years, that the 1994s would obviously benefit from some sharing of those resources. But in turn, and I think Michael was pointing already to this idea that John Phillips and others have developed over the years, it is a reciprocal relationship. People who are interested in and invested in community engagement have a lot to learn from the 1994s in terms of how they go about creating engagement with the communities that, again, it's built right into their mission statement. So there was a report that there was great interest in this, but at the same time, the problem was that the relationships that had been developed between the 1862s and the 1994s to date have been very spotty. And what we'll see is there will be a one-off relationship, perhaps around research, but nothing that engages faculty and nothing that helps people who are involved with the community get together. Or there are a number of community engagement efforts, but not necessarily any research or teaching. And again, there are very few teaching and learning partnerships, but devoid then of any research or community engagement contacts as well. So the tribal leaders were saying, thanks for the beginning partnerships, but these really need to be strengthened, and in places where there are none, they really need to be built. In turn, we have another article that's coming out in the summer edition of the Tribal College Journal that talks more about the interviews that we did with the tribal leaders themselves. And so that will be coming out, I think, next month, if I'm remembering correctly, in terms of my contact with the editor. But in terms of kind of giving you a spoiler alert here, these are the basic issues that were described by the tribal leaders in terms of what they need at this present time based on what they are dealing with. And over and over and over again, it's why I highlighted the food insecurity issue. The topic of food seemed to have permeated most of the discussions that we had with the leaders of the Native nations that we had talked to. You can obviously see that many of these other crises beneath food are also obviously related to food. So, you know, obviously, if you're having a water crisis, you're going to have a very difficult time raising food and so on. So there seems to be a very strong need to be paying attention to food-oriented issues. And that spans the globe, though. There are all kinds of different food issues. For some, it was really more about food security. Others, it was about food safety. For still others, it was more about food sovereignty. And while these again are related, I think it's important for us to note here that we need to learn a lot more about these food-related issues and to see where the possible connections actually are between the needs and the areas of expertise. So, sorry, I don't know. Yeah, okay. So next here then is raising the question then, so how do we facilitate these partnerships? And this is where we really got into a discussion amongst our research team members about whether or not this was the place where we might most actively pursue what we were calling low-hanging fruit in terms of being able to make these things happen. And so this idea of how we move these really large, very complex institutions that are the 1862 land grants on some course of action that would allow them to begin to think about reparative activities. It seemed like the win-win relationships that could be formulated, or if they already were in place, to be strengthened between the 1994s and the 1862s was a good place to begin to really push hard. So fortunately, and I saw that Aaron Riley is on this call, I was able to be in close contact with Aaron fairly early on in our thinking about this. And one of the things that Aaron had suggested was that I write a conference grant to begin to help people, to bring people together who are already thinking about this, but also to attract the attention of other people who may actually have an interest in this, but not really understand how to get involved in these kinds of partnerships. So I was fortunate enough then to really scale up very quickly a number of what NIFA calls collaborating investigators. And you can see that we had, again, a mix of native and non-native organizations. Again, First Nations very much wanted to be a part of this. And also Barry Dunn from South Dakota State University gets a lot of credit, along with John Phillips, for being able to begin to talk to some of the 1994 tribal presidents about the need to have their input on a grant like this, as well as, again, you see from our North Central region, our West region, all of the different organizations that are extension-based and agricultural experiment station-based to get people together to begin to talk about this. You already know that we got the grant. That's the reason why I have this, this push to get the information out about October 19th. So we are a part of this. We are planning this to become a part of the front end of the Falcon Conference, which will begin on October 20th and run through the 22nd. So our hope is that this grant and the efforts that we're undertaking at this time will bring people together in Albuquerque to begin to talk about this, and more details will be coming about that as well. But in general, and again, I'm at risk of repeating myself, what we want to make sure we understand is what's already happened and what is already happening in order to build a bigger and better and brighter future for these kinds of partnerships. And so a lot of the work that I will be doing over the course of the next several months, and we'll talk about that in a little bit more in a second, is to begin to catalog, building on the work of Katie Hartman and others, what has been done in the Western region, but also scaling up and understanding in even more detail what's happening in the North Central region. And again, I want to point out that there will be a very strong, but not an exclusive focus on food-related issues. Again, food sovereignty, food security, food safety, they will all be in the mix. But what we'll really want to do, and that's again why this is the first objective of this conference, we will want to define our terms. We will want to make sure that we're clear about all the different issues that are related to food that we want to go on in terms of the conversation that we're going to have. We do want to make sure that we're also cataloging any efforts that have been done in the past between native and non-native stakeholders, regardless of whether or not they have happened inside of the confines of land-grant universities. That's objective number 2. But then obviously honing our focus on those partnerships that have been occurring between the 1994 and the 1862 land grants. And then our hope is that what this does is it really provides a platform or a springboard towards the development of what, for want of a better way of describing it, is a national clearinghouse or support center that not only catalogs what's happening, but catalogs what needs to happen in terms of building out these partnerships. Again, thank you, Michael, for your support, and Maria Marshall in my becoming a faculty fellow. I'm very pleased to have been able to write what I consider really to be a supplemental grant to the NIFA work in order to provide a really strong focus on the North Central region. And because of the NCRCRD funding that I've received as a faculty fellow, I'm going to be able to do that. So this grant will help us to bring some very special attention to the North Central region. We have a variety of mechanisms that we will have in place to do outreach, first to the 20 tribal colleges and gain their perspectives on past and present partnerships that they have with the 1862 land grants, and then reaching back out to those 12 1862 land grants to gather further information from kind of their side of the aisle, if you will, about how these partnerships have been developed over time. And our hope is that a part of the conference presentation itself on October 19th will include a report out on the efforts that we've undertaken as a result of the NCRCRD grant. There, I think I just said, I didn't realize I had a slide for that, so I'm just going to skip past that. So again, it gets us back down to this idea of what can we be doing where we do not create either or situations inside of land grants. So how is it then that we can make it possible to continue to be land grant fierce, to be proud of the tripartite mission that we, for 160 plus years, have been undertaking, and at the same time to hold the idea of the land grant truth in our collective minds and hearts, and understand that there are things that we have to do to make this right. And so, and I think I did pretty good time-wise. I think we have plenty of time now to begin to have a Q&A about these kinds of things. I also did not pay any attention whatsoever to any of the chats. But I see Ron Wilson saying that I named 3 tribes that are names of Kansas counties today. And the Shawnee and the Wyandotte in particular, if I'm remembering correctly, and the Ottawa as well, are largely located now in Oklahoma. So I find it interesting that those are the names of Kansas counties as well. And Ron, I just have to admit, I do not have any idea whatsoever about the connection with Kansas. The Potawatomi themselves are, they continue to exist in states as close as Michigan, which is where my friend John Lau has done some of his academic work, but also Indiana, and Indiana is where John is actually from. And John also spent many years in Illinois, and I know the Potawatomi are also there. So I'll have to ask John about the connection with Kansas. So I can't speak to that, but I find that to be very interesting. So anyway, at this point in time, Michael, I don't know how to best do the question and answer portion, or just inviting people to speak on this, but I'm willing to go anywhere that folks want to go.
Yeah, we've got about 86 folks on, so quite a few individuals. We can try the popcorn out, if you will. If there's someone that has a question, they can go on video and unmute their mic and ask their question. If all 86 of us try at the same time, then we might need to raise hands kind of thing, using the reactions button in the lower right. But if you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat. We can monitor the chat, or you should feel free to unmute yourself and ask away. Do we have any questions?
Or does Brian want to talk more about the power of diversity? Didn't know where you were going to go with that, Brian, but I'm happy to talk more about that as well. And while we're waiting, I see there's a new message that's come up here. Oh, there's plenty of things that are beginning to populate now, but can we just go back for a second? I know that Dan had written here earlier about Aaron Riley also being the project leader of FERTEP. And so at some point, it doesn't have to be right now, but Aaron, if you want to get on and talk a little bit about that, please, by all means, let's enter that into the conversation. Dan, thanks for that shout out there to Aaron about that. So Chris,
Sure.
Oh, Aaron, go ahead, hop on.
Yeah, happy to. Or Dan, I'm surprised Dan hasn't unmuted himself and told you I was not prepared to be on camera, so I apologize. I got my hair up in a bun. Yeah, so we have quite a few programs at NIFA, and the federally recognized Tribes Extension Program is one as well. That's it is a small funded program, but has an enormous impact. And Dan has been a project director on that for many, many, many years. And he probably could speak greatly for that. They do an enormous amount of extension work throughout all of, really all of the country, but they're stationed in currently 35 different reservations throughout the country. So fantastic program, as well as on top of the 1994 programs.
Aaron, since you're on camera and you were willing to speak, can you talk just a little bit? I mean, you had such enthusiasm for this conference grant, and you made so many great things happen. I just wondered if you might give the NIFA or USDA perspective on where this fits in terms of some of the larger things that are going on. I mean, I know clearly that there's been a recent call for commentary about the Blue Ribbon Panel that's come up. I'm just wondering if you might speak to that briefly.
Sure. So I think, I guess coming from national, so I'm a national program leader at NIFA, and we do funding throughout the country for USDA. And one of the things that we are really prioritizing is getting 1862s, 1994s really working together. In extension, which is our FERTEP program, the 1994s has extension program, but also in the research space as well as education, trying to look at students and student resources through the K through 12 system. We have a New Beginning for Tribal Students program that is can be used for scholarships. It can be used for a lot of different things. I really think what we're hoping that this conference grant will do will be bridge some relationships, and whatever comes out of it in terms of, maybe some discussions of healing need to happen, and that can happen. But I really think that's part of what we're hoping will occur, and then see where we can go from there. There's been a lot of work in trying to get 1862s, 1994s, FERTEP communities all kind of bridged and working together in unison, and the more work that we can do in the space, the better. And so when Steve brought this idea up, we thought, wow, well, how about a conference grant? And John Phillips is really the one who I think deserves an enormous amount of credit here, because he does the Falcon Conference every year, and so being able to partner with John Phillips is a huge win for this project that Steve and what Mike Wilcox and his team is doing. I see Dan. Dan, are you ready to talk?
Can you hear me, Aaron?
Yeah, I got you.
Oh, okay, good. Yeah. Well, thank you. I was just going to add on the question that they asked about integrating 4-H with tribes and partnerships. Also, on a Colville Indian Reservation, our FERTEP project, we worked with the Tribal Council and Washington State University, and we have our first tribal 4-H program. It's the equivalent of a county 4-H program. And so the kids will have a choice. They can either join one of the two counties that overlap, or they could join the Colville Confederated Tribes 4-H program. And the Tribal Council has been greatly supportive. They're even paying the membership dues for the kids because they see the value in the 4-H. And so with that partnership with the Tribal Council and other ones, it's been a real success. So I just wanted to add that a little bit. So thank you. And thanks for your work, Aaron.
Don't thank me yet. We got grants coming out in a few months.
So let me just say a couple more things about the 4-H youth development connection that Ingela had raised in the chat box. So first of all, let me just go back and say, from the standpoint of land-grant universities more generally, I think it's really important for us to recognize that extension has a very large role to play here. Again, it's not an exclusive role, but it's a very large role, because from 1914 on through the Smith-Lever Act, extension was really given the primary task of taking all of the knowledge and all of the research findings and disseminating them into the farms and families and communities that the land-grant universities were supposed to be, by design, serving. So I think that it's really important to say that from the outset, and that anytime you can pull extension in, I think it's extraordinarily useful to do so, as well as being consistent with the mission. Now, the interesting thing that we actually reported in our 2018 book on the future of land-grant universities is that extension suffers from some marketing issues. People do not understand, oftentimes the general public does not understand exactly what extension is or whether or not extension actually exists, except if you mention 4-H. And in fact, just to tell you a story that happened in my interviews. So after the book came out, there were many reporters that wanted to talk with me and also with President Gee about the content of our book. And the number one question was always, what's the difference between a land grant and any other public university? And I always said that was the easiest question to answer. And they waited, and I said, extension. And then honestly, 50% of the folks that I said extension to said, what's extension? And then I said, have you ever heard of 4-H? And they say, oh, yeah, I've heard of 4-H. And then they say, wait a second, that's extension? So I think that we also need to pay attention to the disconnect that sometimes happens between people understanding what 4-H is and people understanding what extension is. So that's a long way, Mingla, of saying that I think 4-H holds particular promise here in terms of being a more widely recognized resource throughout the country. And I think we just simply have to do a better job of being able to connect 4-H to its larger extension roots. Now, saying that, and on top of what Dan had mentioned, I also remember, Aaron, that there was a webinar that you hosted not too long ago where there was someone who had done a 4-H program in Indian country that came from the University of Idaho, correct?
Yes. Yeah, we have a few.
So there, yeah. So I'm happy to say that I think that there are a number of efforts that are already underway that might more easily be brought in to these kinds of efforts. So, but again, I think it's going to take some coordinated effort to be able to bring some greater visibility to these programs, and then to begin to figure out how is it that other universities can learn from Washington State, can learn from the University of Idaho, if they're interested in doing this kind of 4-H programming. I want to go just kind of in order. First of all, thanks to Christopher Petty for pointing out that the Potawatomi have a reservation in Kansas. I did not know that. I'm sure that my friend John Lau would kick me for not knowing that, but thanks for pointing that out. And Martin, you had asked about connections to Illinois and the University of Illinois. The one very large connection that I know of between some of my collaborators and people at the University of Illinois is through something called Humanity Without Walls. And I don't know if people in the audience are familiar with that, but there is a very forward-facing set of efforts that have to do with racial inequities that the Humanity Without Walls project is interested in funding. And so the head of the Humanities Institute here, Rick Livingston, actually has some fairly extensive ties to Illinois and to the people inside of the Humanity Without Walls effort. But that, Martin, that's the extent to which I know right now about those connections. I also do know, however, that the University of Illinois has had a range of different issues related to mascot issues over the years, and I'm not quite sure where that is at the current moment in terms of how that interfaces with some of the other work that I know that people are doing in terms of building bridges amongst land-grant universities. So I just wanted to go back and say that. Brian's writing more. My lovely colleague here at Ohio State. Aaron, you're getting more props here in the chat from Brian about the work that you're doing. And Nancy Potter, you asked about folks in Nebraska, what they're doing. My contact to date with Nebraska people has largely been through Ted Hibbler. And Ted is one of the tribal, maybe the only tribal extension agent for the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. And Ted has been, I think, attempting to work with the president and his council there to move some things forward. So I think that Ted would probably be the person that I would be reaching out to. And Nancy, if you want, you can write to me. I'd be happy to make those introductions as well. Michael, I'm going to catch up by reading. Is there anything that caught your eye that we should be bringing up here?
Yeah, there's I think you can continue on reading. There's a couple of interesting, some are just comments, and there aren't real questions, but they may be things that you would like to comment on. I know our director, Meredith for the Purdue Center for Regional Development, Sam Cordes, he wrote about Barry Dunn's work and mentioned the moral lecture at APLU. I noticed that you linked to NIFA's announcement of Barry doing that, President Dunn's lecture there in 2019, but I don't know if there's a recording or something that people can refer to actually hear what was said then in 2019.
Yeah, Barry actually, I think, has that published on his presidential website.
Okay.
And if not, there actually, I think there are two other links, one of which was in my NASA article that also point to that. I give President Dunn the world of kudos for having done this work before any of us knew about this. Mm-hmm. The Wokini Initiative, which is a Lakota term meaning new beginnings, is a project that he undertook several years prior to Tristan Atone and Bobby Lee putting out the LandGrab University report. And he was doing that in part, obviously, his mom was a Rosebud tribal member. And so he felt obviously a great affinity to tribal nations throughout South Dakota. But again, it wasn't just personal to him. He's so very knowledgeable about the challenges, economic, educational, and otherwise, that tribal members who are just as important a stakeholder or group as anyone else in South Dakota, how he's managed that. And under very trying political circumstances, there has been a fairly strong and negative reaction to many issues surrounding diversity and equity issues in the state of South Dakota. And I think that it just gives Barry Dunn all the more credit for the work that he has done and continues to do, and not just at South Dakota State University. I think that he definitely deserves credit for some of the more national efforts, the New Beginnings money that's out there. Barry really spearheaded. I think that again, I could spend an hour just praising Barry Dunn for everything that he's done, that he has done.
I appreciate that, Steve. There was a note from Lisa Townsend at URI. I went to URI for 2 years, go Rams. She mentions that there's a need for this effort in states without 1994 institutions. And you and I have talked at length about this. The University of Rhode Island is working hard to build a relationship with our local tribal community, the Narragansett Indian tribe. Many of us, or a bunch of us, live in states like Indiana, where there may not be federally recognized tribes or state recognized or reservations, and we're challenged sometimes in trying to connect with those communities. Can you talk a little bit about working in states that maybe don't have the infrastructure that they might have in some other states?
Yeah, thanks for that, Lisa. And I really appreciate the work that you're talking about undertaking. One of my alma maters is the University of Connecticut, and they likewise are reaching out to local tribes there as well, and have a really strong student organization, Native American students who are leading that effort, which again, it's always amazing to see the power that students have to transform what a university is doing. And so those students are working with faculty and staff at the University of Connecticut. And it sounds like in very similar ways to what's happening at the University of Rhode Island. So the one interesting difference between Rhode Island and Ohio is that we don't have any state or federally recognized tribes, as Michael had talked about. In fact, there are 7 states in total which kind of follow the Appalachian Mountains. So Arkansas is the first of those that have neither state or federally recognized tribes. I'm looking off in the distance because this is what my brain does when I'm thinking about the map. Then Tennessee, Kentucky, West Virginia, Ohio, Pennsylvania, skips over New York and hits New Hampshire. I think that's the 7 if I name 7 of them. So those 7 states have an even more interesting set of challenges because they all don't have tribal colleges, and they also don't have any federally or state recognized tribes either. That should not be a reason for not doing this work. And in fact, our group is in contact with Michigan State because we're very interested, because many of the, well, actually the closest tribes whose land was taken in order to found Ohio State and sold, taken and sold, come from Michigan, all 3 of those tribes. And so Michigan State has a couple of really wonderful programs, including the MILES program, which is placing extension agents inside of tribal communities. And we want to partner with Michigan State in order to partner with those tribes. What we found, and this should be the incentive for other places, University of Rhode Island and all of the other states east of the Mississippi that do not have tribal colleges, we have found that there is a 65% overlap in the tribes that Ohio State had land that they benefited from that touch on other universities. In fact, there were 38 other universities that had land given to them by force, obviously, or broken treaty by the same tribes. So we share a kinship with many other land-grant universities in terms of who we mutually benefited from. And so there's also great reason for us to be thinking about how this shouldn't necessarily just be a one-off effort, but rather we need to be thinking about this more systematically because there's such an intense overlap. So sorry, Michael, I got a little bit carried away there in terms of Lisa's original point, but I just thought I would add that particular piece as well.
Yeah, and here's another very interesting comment. Stephen, you mentioned food insecurity is one of the key issues raised by tribal leaders. This also correlates with obesity and chronic diseases. What are some of the impactful and measurable initiatives that Extension could implement to improve conditions on the food insecurity front?
That's a good question. That opens up a whole nother can of worms, right?
Yeah.
This is why, I mean, I'm only hesitating here because I don't even know enough about food related issues to even be remotely dangerous or qualified to answer that question. That's why we need this pre-conference. That's why I think what we need to do is we need to bring people together who have this expertise, but don't necessarily work right now with tribal communities, or vice versa, people who are working with tribal communities, but need that kind of expertise and are looking for it. Yeah. So, I think that question stymied me enough to say, this is why we all need to get together and we need to talk about it. But Michael, do you have, you work in this area. Do you have ideas about this?
Yeah, so it's very, very complicated. Obviously, if it weren't complicated, then we would have solved it already. I think one of the interesting dimensions to it from this perspective is that there's also a food sovereignty piece to all of this. And so oftentimes we're thinking about a food desert, and we're thinking about supply, or we're thinking about how do we match supply with the demand that's there. Well, this goes beyond economics when we're talking about sovereignty, because now we're talking about really hyper local or regional food systems where we want this, or we're seeking the sovereignty to be able to feed ourselves and not having to potentially rely on others, if you will. So it's a security issue, but it's also a sovereignty issue as well. And we have technologies that are thousands of years old that we should be relying on. These are the traditional indigenous technologies and knowledge and know-how that there's still a place for, and yet the climate is changing at the same time and making some of those things more challenging to implement, not to mention water rights issues and all of these other things that are, and property rights issues that become now really wicked issues when it comes to trying to solve these things. So it requires holistic solutions. And so it requires reaching across program areas. It requires reaching across departments, and it's going to require reaching across institutions as well. And if we're not doing that efficiently and effectively, then it can become a real challenge, not to mention the resource dynamic or dimension that's at play as well. We need adequate resources and in order for us to be able to address these issues. So coming together makes a lot of sense. I guess since we're talking about coming together, I'll throw out that NIFA not only has NIFA feels so strongly about this. They not only have funded the effort that's going to happen at Falcon in the pre-conference in October, they've also funded a conference grant for the National Association of Community Development Extension Professionals to remove the financial barriers facing extension professionals from 1890s and 1994s to attend NACDEP. And so that's in June the 5th through the 8th. Certainly food security is going to be one of those issues that we're going to be talking about, local regional food systems. And there was a scholarship. All of the scholarships, thankfully, have been awarded now. And so we're going to have people that otherwise weren't going to be able to attend NACDEP able to attend because they have full ride scholarships to be able to come to Indianapolis this year. So that's really, really exciting. And we really appreciate NIFA's support in this effort.
That's awesome.
Yeah,
and I just wanted, I noticed one thing, Mingla, who had written earlier, she wants to learn more and she's at Cornell. Mingla, the good news is our postdoc, Michael Charles, is going to be has been hired by Cornell. Okay. And so you're actually going to have one of our project team members as a brand new assistant professor. And I think in the American Indian Studies program, there's a big diversity hiring initiative that's going on at Cornell right now. And so Michael is one of their early hires. So if you write to me, I can connect you now so that the two of you can hit the ground running when he gets there in August.
And he is a Cornellian, as I recall, so he'll be able to hit the ground running, already having put in 4 years there as an undergraduate. So that's really, really exciting. There's Ron Wilson mentions, in terms of land acknowledgements, the greatest sensitivity has surfaced in relation to stolen lands. It's been tough to get to the historical truth of who stole land from whom. Any comments or suggestions?
Yeah, so we're doing a lot of work on land acknowledgements at Ohio State. I'm sad to say we don't have an official one at Ohio State right now. And so, and in fact, the unofficial one is incorrect. It actually names the Cherokee, and the Cherokee, according to the Cherokee themselves, have no real claim to Ohio land. So what that tells us is that whoever was doing this land acknowledgement was not reaching out to tribal leaders in order to make sure that there was a reciprocal agreement about what should be said. So part of the actions that we're undertaking are making suggestions like that to university administration, that if they want to do this, or if there's a movement right now in the faculty senate to do this, that they keep in mind the need to be in contact with the tribal leaders of those tribes that are going to be named in the land acknowledgement. Another big problem with land acknowledgements is that it talks about the land that you're on, but not necessarily the land from a land grant perspective that you benefited from. And so I think that land acknowledgements have to take that into account as well. And then again, Michael, you already said this, but let me underscore the point because you can't say it often enough. If the land acknowledgement is just a box that you're checking, then no one that I know in the Native community wants it. They really want this to be a precursor to action that's going to be taken. And it really then, the land acknowledgement has to become a so what. So you've acknowledged it, so what? And I also think, because Ron, you really pointed out the idea about the stolen land perspective. Nothing will get a university to clam up quicker than bringing up an issue that has legal implications. And so there's another set of writings that I'm doing with Teresa Ambo. She's a Native scholar at the University of California, San Diego, in which we're trying to provide a Native and non-Native view about land acknowledgements. And it includes the idea of starting with relationships themselves and not getting into the nitty-gritty of who took what from whom, but rather, is our relationship where it should be right now? It's something that Sean Wilson has written about from a research perspective, calling it relational accountability. And it's this idea of saying, more generally, is the university in a place where it really is proud of the relationship that it has with its Native community stakeholders? And if the answer is no, then the first set of actions that have to be taken should surround how do you begin to work on that. And at the end of the day, and by the way, I'm a trained marriage and family therapist, so I mean everything to me is seen through the lens of relationships. It really all starts and ends with those very personal relationships that we develop. And so you know, if you don't have significant interpersonal relationships with people, then making a land acknowledgement, it's not going to work. And so I really think that you need to look at those relationships first and foremost. And yes, and very much stay away from terminology like stolen land. The fact of the matter is that land-grant universities came into existence after the land was already taken. Now, many of my Native friends will say, well, that's just, you've received stolen goods. And yes, that's true, but that's not typically the place that you want to start in terms of building a relationship. I think you can get to that, but it's not the place that you actually start.
Speaking of building relationships, Steve, I did want to mention that we were talking a lot about 4-H, and so Christopher Petty has stood up and mentioned that he's a program specialist with USDA NIFA Division of Youth and an enrolled member as well of a tribe in Kansas, and he's given his personal information, his email and his contact information, and is asking people to develop a personal relationship with him to learn more about how we can work in how 4-H can work effectively and in a culturally sensitive and responsible way in Indian country. So please do reach out to Christopher if you have additional questions. We have the APLU lecture that's there. We have 16 new messages, so we have a lot of different things. And we have someone from Nebraska, Eleanor, reached out saying, if you want to learn more about working in Indian country in Nebraska, please reach out to her. FERTEP project directors can help as well. People. Okay, I'm sorry, I'm just trying to go through everything here. There's lots of story maps in here. Okay, a lot of information being.
Michael, this is probably a good point to just ask. Will the chat be saved so that people can
Yep, we can save it. There's a lot of rich discussion here and a lot of links that are being shared. So I think that that's important. Eleanor did mention on the food sovereignty piece, restoring traditional foods is complicated by the interruptions in foodways due to removals and relocation of tribes. So establishing food sovereignty in many cases is not a matter of reestablishing traditional ways, but rather a matter of tribes establishing new traditional ways for themselves due to the displacement. Lots of different cool stuff and indigenous foods. Awesome. Courtney, one of my favorite people on earth. They ask, I have a question brewing, not sure on wording. Stephen mentioned, oh, I'm sorry, it's a direct message to me. So let me read it first. Stephen, if you, before I blow their cover here. Oh, she just, they just said, it's okay, haha. Let me see, mentioned not knowing history. It seems like the start of accountability to history is making sure all extension professionals are aware of the history. What else might accountability look like in practice across extension systems? And if I may, Steve, before I hand this off to you, I completely agree with Courtney. I think they're spot on that it really requires going back and understanding the history. And there's a lot of really good resources out there, but it takes time to sit down and familiarize yourself with them. We mentioned South Dakota earlier. I happen to be reading a chapter out of American Holocaust today. And if you haven't read that book by David Stannard, it's a very, very interesting book, but he was talking about L. Frank Baum, the author of Wizard of Oz. And he wrote some things in the Aberdeen newspaper back in the 1800s that would make your hair curl, how racist they were against Native Americans, and basically asking for their, or being pro-extermination, if you will, in the editorials that he wrote in the 1800s. And you wouldn't know that for, you know, not having read some of these works that are out there. So Indigenous Peoples' History is another book that a lot of people have read that shines some light on some things that we normally don't learn in the classroom. But it also means it's incumbent upon us to do the work. We can't ask our Native friends to do the work for us. And so we need to put in the sweat equity and be able to teach ourselves and listen to others and learn, which is why a webinar like today is so important. Steve, do you have something you'd like to mention in response to Courtney's request for, you know, how do we help extension or empower extension to be able to work in this space through education?
Yeah, well, I think education's the first piece of this, right? I mean, that's why I was thrilled on the faculty side of things when AAUP picked up a piece that John Lau and I wrote together, because that's going to go out to 40,000 faculty members, right? I mean, I think that the thing that we were amazed about first was that when we began our project a year after the LandGrab University report came out, that everyone we talked to, I shouldn't say everyone, almost everyone we talked to still hadn't read that report a year later. Mm-hmm. And that was concerning to us. But then the second wave of our need to better understand the lack of information dissemination was when we were talking to tribal leaders and the leaders of tribal colleges, and they weren't aware of the LandGrab University report either. So in some ways, we were asking them questions. I mean, of course, they knew their land was taken, but they never made the connection between the LandGrant University and the land that was taken from them. And so I think that there are bridges that need to be built. And the reason I'm saying that in the context of Courtney's question is, who better to provide education than extension? Mm-hmm. And so I think that we need to figure out exactly how that can be done. And again, how it can be done in a coordinated way, because it will save everyone from trying to figure it out for themselves. So I would think that this would be something that at a national level, extension would want to become involved in, because it would be of great service to everybody.
I can't agree more, Steve. Heidi mentioned that can I just say it's so important to work with and develop projects with the tribes and or the tribal colleges and universities rather than just coming at us with preconceived ideas of what will make a difference in our communities. That idea that, and you talk about the collaboration continuum in one of the papers that you shared with us, it has to go beyond like coordination, if you will. It has to be true collaboration. Can you talk a little bit about developing projects with people rather than for people, that sort of by and for concept versus, for.
Mm-hmm. Well, so that was meant to be what the Kellogg Commission report, especially the one on in community engagement, was supposed to underscore, which is that the old model, and again, that was the old extension model, the old county extension model, the county agent model was, hi, we're here from the university and we have expertise on soil science and we're going to help you, right? And that's what we provide because we're the experts in it. And over the years, and again, especially I think starting with the Kellogg Commission, the coined term engagement came from a desire to get beyond the old model. When you talk to Gordon and Dick Stoddard and the people who were involved in that Kellogg Commission report, they were picking a term that connoted a big difference. And it was meant to be this idea that you were going to engage with people in a conversation about what they needed. So that rather than say, this is what I'm going to provide to you, then you needed to listen to what it is that people need. Now, that lines up perfectly with a general sentiment in Native communities, which is nothing for us without us. And so I think if we keep in mind that Native communities, just like any other community, are the experts in what they need, then we need to be doing a lot more listening and a lot less thinking we know what it is that they need. And again, we, even inside of our project, we had been routinely reminded about that. Even general suppositions about how we were asking questions and what we thought, the categories were inside of responses, we were completely blown out of the water time and again, because we had preconceived notions about what people were going to say to us rather than listening for the sake of listening. So really more of a formative response rather than more of a summative response, which again, we're typically guilty of inside of the halls of academia. And speaking of what we're guilty of inside of the halls of academia is this general pride that we carry about what we do know. I mean, we are experts, right? This is why we went to school as long as we did and why we're not out working in the private sector, right? I mean, we have a mission, we have a vocation. We have a vocational response to many things. And yet, I think the very thing that we need to do the most when we're doing this kind of work is to develop a sense of humility about what we do not know. And I think that that's the key to responding to what Heidi was saying, which is to genuinely approach people and say, I have a desire to help, but I'm betting I don't know how to help. How do we begin to have a dialogue about what you need and what I can provide?
Thank you very much for that, Steve. We have about 6 minutes left. The floor is open. You all have done a wonderful job maintaining a high level of questions here in the chat. You may unmute if you wish and ask a question or make a statement. Heidi's very happy with your response, Steve. So when we see you at Falcon, we can high five.
There we go.
Together.
Well, Michael, that's the one thing that we said we were going to talk about, which we haven't done yet. So in these last 6 minutes, do people have ideas about what we absolutely have to do in order to get people to show up? Because that's what we really want. We were hoping that we have 57 people left. Maybe the others voted with their feet. No, I saw some people had to go teach. But how do we get these 57 people to Albuquerque, New Mexico? What is it that we must do in order to get everyone there?
Feel free to respond to Steve by unmuting or throw your great ideas in the chat.
Or just tell us you're coming. Oh, Mingla says I need a scholarship. So part of the money, Mingla, is giving you a hotel voucher for that extra day. So that was one of the things that we had already forecast, was if we were asking people to come for another day, that we should pay for your hotel room, or at least part of your hotel room. And so we will have that. We will also feed you breakfast, lunch, and dinner. So again, hopefully that defrays some of the cost of being with us during that day. And of course, for people who can't make it, we are also figuring out how to record everything so that other people can benefit. But we really do want to have people show up if they can and make that happen.
So Heidi mentions Mingla, I think, is with an 1862, which she is. Cornell, my alma mater. I think the 1994s will most likely be there. I personally would be pretty surprised if my 1862 shows up. So I'm so happy that Heidi says that, because we're hoping, at least the North Central Regional Center for Rural Development is hoping that every single 1862 in the North Central region is going to show up. That's the expectation within NACDEP. I think a lot of the 1862s in NACDEP are planning on sending representatives. I know that Purdue is going to be there, and I'm sure that Michigan State, Wisconsin, Minnesota, NDSU, and a whole bunch of others, not to leave others out, I think are going to be there as well. We've been attending the last 2 years online, and we're pretty excited about being face-to-face finally. So I'm hopeful that there'll be lots of 1862s and all of the 1994s there, and maybe even some 1890s showing up as well for a wonderful conversation, a really productive conference. Stephen, I assume you agree Ohio State will be there.
Oh, we'll have a big contingent there.
Yep.
Yeah, no, and people that aren't necessarily even connected to our program, but know about this and have designs on other things that they want to do. So yes, there will be a fairly significant Ohio State contingent there. I know, again, Michael Charles will already be representing Cornell. He's already made those plans. So I know Cornell will be there as well. I know the people from, at least 2 people from the University of Connecticut are going to be there because of my prior discussions with them. And so I think that the more that we get the word out that this is actually happening, as people begin to realize they have to make flight and hotel plans, I think we'll see a good uptick. Also, we have APLU is one of our collaborating investigators. And so I have not actually talked to Sheila Martin or Doug Steele, but I'm assuming that one or the both of them will be there. They actually both co-edited an article that will be in the Journal of Scholarship and Engagement. And it deals very specifically with this issue. So I know that APLU is thinking about this as well. So my hope is that an APLU presence would prompt more 1862s to want to show up as well.
There'll be federally recognized tribes extension agents and project directors there too. So we usually get quite a good cohort of them as well.
This is reminding me, Steve, just so you know, I did have a conversation with John Phillips on Friday, and he's getting weak in the knees in terms of rooms and in terms of like where it's going to be, what rooms, what we need in terms of technology and hotel rooms. And so we should probably circle up with John. And now that we have a deluge of 1862s and 1994s coming to Albuquerque in October, we'll need to make sure that we've got the infrastructure in place.
Well, that's funny that you say that. I love John dearly. And John was saying to me, so I'm looking for rooms where there should be, like we're not going to have more than 50 people here. And I said, John, I wrote the grant for 100. Mm-hmm. And he was like, oh, okay, I'm going to have to look for a bigger room then.
Even if it's just Aaron Riley's friends, we're going to have 100 people there. So, you know.
Well, hey, we should have problems like this, right? I mean, my goodness, if we had the problem of too many people showing up for this, that would be an amazingly wonderful thing to actually have happen.
Yeah. If Mingla drives out from Ithaca, that'll be interesting. Ithaca to Albuquerque. I don't know how long that's going to take, but it's probably worthy of a good blog. Maybe she can catch a ride with Michael. Anyone would like the last word? Okay, yeah, you'll receive an email, Shelley Serber. She rocks.
I think this is really building that relationship,
Yep.
the 1862s, the federally recognized tribes extension programs and the TCUs is so needed. And I really want to say thank you to for stepping up and recognizing that. I think that's huge. So I appreciate it. So thank you. And Michael, I appreciate it.
Thanks to everyone for attending today. I want to thank Stephen, our main speaker. Thank you so much, our faculty fellow. This has been fantastic. We look forward to seeing you next month when we're talking about workforce development in rural America. We'll see you all soon, if not at the webinar, at NACDEP in June, and most certainly in Albuquerque in October. Take care, everyone. Stay safe, and we'll talk to you soon.